Good morning, everyone. I think we are live. I have done the millennial pause just to make sure. So happy for everyone who's decided to join us this morning. We are going to be here to talk this morning about a couple of recent decisions from the Federal Trade Commission implicating location data and privacy. Should be a really exciting conversation. Thanks for joining us. I'm Stacey Gray from the Future of Privacy Forum, a senior director on our US policy team. And I'm joined today by one of my amazing colleagues, Dr. Massey, and one of our very good friends, Selke. I'm going to turn it over to them first to say a quick word about who they are. So, Aaron.
Yeah, I'm Massey. I'm a technologist and senior policy analyst for advertising and platforms here at FPF. And I come from a technical background, don't have a law degree, but I'm interested in discussing these cases with you.
My name is Selke, and I have been working with geospatial data for about 30 years. First in mapping for in-vehicle navigation, and then more recently in a series of chief privacy officer roles. And I'm very excited to be speaking with all of you today, as this is one of my favorite topics.
Excellent. So we should first say a little bit about what these cases were. We're actually going to be talking two cases today. When we scheduled this, it was only one, and then another one came out. So the Federal Trade Commission has recently, just in the last 3 weeks, settled with two companies that are significant in the field of location analytics and location data. The first one is against Xmode Social, Xmode for short, Xmode Social, which was then succeeded and rebranded as OutLogic, a location data broker engaged in the collection and sale of sensitive location information through a software development kit or an SDK. And that was January 9th, which apparently was yesterday, feels like yesterday, and followed last Thursday by a very similar case against a relatively similar company, a location data aggregator called InMarket, or InMarket Media LLC, another location data aggregator that provides a software development kit for mobile apps. And just to explain a little bit about how that works for anyone who might be joining us for the first time or new to the location data industry, this is an industry involving the collection of location data from smartphone apps through the deployment of a software development kit. And often that is related to targeted advertising, as is in the case of InMarket, but not always. It could be related simply to location intelligence or location analytics or location data for research purposes or transportation analytics. And both of these cases are really significant. In Xmode, I want to give people a quick summary of the facts there. Xmode, the Xmode decision involved a decision focused heavily on the concept of sensitive locations. According to the FTC's complaint, the company just did not have the policies in place to remove sensitive locations prior to sharing the raw location data, selling it onward or downstream, and did not implement the right safeguards against future downstream uses. And according to the FTC, this is an unfair practice. There are a couple of other really novel aspects of that decision that we're going to get into, but this was the core of it. In contrast, the case from last week against InMarket also dealt with the onward sharing and sale of location data, but was a bit broader in my opinion with respect to the outcome, because it dealt with the type of detail you need to get appropriate consent from users to collect location data. In the FTC's view, it was not enough to inform users that location data would be used for elements of functionality in an app, like shopping rewards or making shopping lists. You have to also tell individuals that their information will be used for targeted advertising. All right, that's a very poor explanation of these two cases, but you can find more. We'll put some of the information and links to the two cases in our chat as we speak. And I'll turn it over maybe first to Kara to talk a little bit about the significance of these two. This is being hailed as the first location data broker cases from the FTC, but it's broader than that. I think we agree, has implications beyond location data and has implications beyond data brokers, a label that we've been talking a lot about what that means. So Kara, you have a lot of experience in this industry working with companies like Xmode and InMarket. What do you make of this? And while you tell us, I'll drop some links in the chat for folks who want to check it out.
Thank you very much, Stacey. I'll start with this. It is our job as privacy professionals to protect people. People, not places, but people in places. And when I look at what's happening with the FTC decisions and investigations and so on, I recognize just how challenging this subject matter is to govern and create guardrails around. And I think for the first time, what we're seeing is an attempt by the FTC to actually introduce some very important concepts into the governance. And that is around context and use case. These consent orders show a combination of an effort to, I'd say, use a blunt force instrument by saying, thou shalt not collect, use, and share data about discrete locations that are sensitive, combined with, let's look at the particular use case. And in the case of these two instances we're talking about, there's a very specific focus on creating profiles and grouping people into sensitive locations. Or sensitive categories, I correct myself.
So what do you make of that blunt instrument? We've been talking about that. The order in Xmode requires them to go through raw location data, which consists of latitude, longitude, a persistent identifier, and usually timestamp. To go through all that information that they have about individual devices and redact or cut out any information that's coming from a location that's deemed to be sensitive, a church, a school, a medical facility. What do we make of that?
I think it's a good start, but if you consider that these places are not in and of themselves sensitive, to just block out and say, let's blacklist based on this particular location, these geospatial coordinates on the Earth that happens to have a building on it that is occupied by a church or an abortion clinic, is not taking into account all kinds of other use cases that may not be direct advertising, interest-based advertising. It could be for research purposes. It could be for transportation analytics. So that begs the question of, well, what does this look like in the future? I call it the Swiss cheese effect, in that potentially if you're creating virtual boundaries around all of these locations that are deemed sensitive, you suddenly have these big giant gaps that are not going to enable the other sorts of functionality, the other sorts of things that people want to do. But having said that, I understand why the FTC has started with this.
It makes a lot of sense. So you're noting, locations are not in themselves sensitive. What we care about is what a location reveals about a person through their visit to a medical facility or a church or a school. And so in some ways, this kind of instrument might be cutting off, I think, in your view, legitimate use cases. I think the opposite is probably also true, which is in some ways it doesn't go far enough, in the fact that there are many other ways to infer sensitive information about individuals, even if they don't visit particular locations. You can glean a lot of information through someone's individual behavior over time to other kinds of locations. Sometimes those are sensitive, sometimes those are just revealings in ways that the person wouldn't expect or wouldn't want. So I think a lot of people would want the FTC to go farther.
And I don't disagree with you. For me, one of the ways that I think about this is I've recently learned about a new project with the American Geographical Society that presents 5 conceptual frameworks for the changing nature of proximity in the 21st century. And I think that these 5 conceptual foundations based in geospatial science, geography, are very, very important. And one of those is connectography, that looks at the connections between us as individuals and the built environment and the physical environment and connections with one another. So it's not just your presence at a particular time, day of week at an abortion clinic, but it could be looking at your behavior, your interactions with others over time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's where looking at things like use case, context, what are the temporal spatial characteristics? What is the outcome? What is the type of data that you're starting with? What are the technical and administrative safeguards that are being put in place? And that's where these examples that the FTC has put forward, for example, with segmentation, I think are good examples of the FTC really trying to get at these concepts of what is the context.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, I agree. I want to dig in further on that, but I also note that the sensitive location data outcome was only one of some of the unique aspects that we thought were pretty cool and interesting and relevant about the X mode case, at least. So sticking with X mode, let me turn it over to you, Dr. Massey. Erin, do you want to tell us a little bit more about some of the significance of this for X mode as an SDK provider? And let me preface that by saying, most of the consumer protection privacy cases that the FTC addresses and brings through enforcement actions deal with consent in the context of a direct relationship with the consumer. But in this case, X mode, although it had, I believe, a couple of apps on its own that it owns, is primarily responsible for collecting location data through other apps that it has a relationship with. How does that work? And tell us about what the FTC said here that's significant for SDK providers.
Well, I'll also just note that what you said about Xmode owning their own apps is also true for in-market, which makes these two cases similar in that respect as well. But it is an interesting point because one of the concerns that the FTC identifies that they're very serious about here is your requirements, your responsibilities with respect to your third-party suppliers as an SDK provider. They say over and over again in the decision that there are more responsibilities than simply providing the SDK and making it available fairly to all of your direct customers, but also you have to provide good example language of notices that would be compliant if you were the first party, so that when a third party takes that on and just uses it directly, they're not automatically in violation. You also have responsibilities for following up to make sure that corrective action is taken when you know of third parties that are not using appropriate language to describe whatever the notice needs to say in order to obtain affirmative expressed consent. This is true for both of the cases, and it is something that they include in the remediation. So for X mode, you have to have a supplier assessment program. There are many requirements listed in what the supplier assessment program has to do related to their third-party suppliers. In market, the wording is slightly different, but it is largely the same. They also have to have a supplier assessment program looking at what third parties are doing with their SDK. And I should note, one of the things that is potentially not obvious is the notice language that's provided in an SDK is unavoidable if you are a developer implementing the SDK. It's not like a privacy policy where you can literally just use the service without reading it. You kind of have to know what the text is in order to be able to make the function call to do the SDK appropriately. It literally will not work unless you're looking at the example language. Now, the extent to which you're reading in depth to understand all of the particular notices may not actually be so detailed, but you have to actually look at it in order to get the wording correct in order for the call to work.
So in the context of privacy and getting consent, the first parties have always had responsibility, but this case says to me that the SDK providers are also not off the hook for the ways in which their SDK is implemented and the ways in which they get noticed, which is somewhat surprising, but very effective, I think, as a legal enforcement action, because you get far more reach in the market. Many SDKs are incorporated into hundreds of apps.
And in some ways, it is actually mirroring what they're asking Xmode and InMarket to do on the remediation side. Mm-hmm. So you have to actually go back and tell your third party, your customers, the people who've actually purchased data from you, this data was collected without affirmative expressed consent. There's a deletion requirement. Actually, the requirement is a little bit more complex than that. It's listed as deletion just in the heading on the decision, but you can delete, you can go back and actually get consent from consumers, which sounds like it would be really challenging. You can desensitize the information or de-identify the information, but whatever remediation you choose, Xmode and InMarket have to go to their customers and say, look, we did not collect this properly. It's not consented data. We have to handle something appropriately. And you can think of the SDK requirements as simply the front end side of that, where on the collection side, you have responsibilities and requirements with the people that are actually using your SDK.
Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent. I want to keep on Xmode for just a minute before we talk about InMarket, because I think the two of them together have really interesting implications for consent and what has to be required in consent. But before we get there, there's another really interesting aspect here that we've talked about, Aaron, and Kara would love to get your thoughts too, which is that SDK providers, in addition to being responsible for how their SDKs get implemented and the kinds of notice that users see, are also now, following this Xmode decision, responsible for respecting operating system requests to opt out of data. This is relatively unique. I think we should talk about why it's unique too, because I think this makes a lot of sort of common sense to folks. There is a setting on both iPhones and Android operating systems for individuals to opt out of personalized advertising from apps at a global level. On the iPhone, knowing it just from personal experience, it's called limit ad tracking. Android calls it something slightly different, opt out of ads personalization, but they both function in the same way, which is that when you enable this setting as a user, the operating system sends a flag to every app that requests the persistent identification number used for advertising, the mobile advertising ID, or the IDFA in Android, but the advertising ID that's used across the board in the advertising ecosystem collected from apps. There's some slight differences. In iPhone, when you enable this setting, it zeroes out the IDFA. In Android, it just sends a little flag. But they both send a notice to apps that that person's data should not be used for personalized advertising and related purposes. That's a contractual requirement between the operating system and the app developers, versus an agreement directly between the advertisers or the app developers and the user. This is the first time, to my knowledge, that the FTC has said directly that companies in that downstream advertising ecosystem must comply with it if it is enabled by the individual. A lot of similarities here to what's going on with the global privacy control and in the broader ad tech world. But this is a pretty unique aspect, and I'm curious to hear from you what impacts you think it'll have on the broader, not just location data, but on the broader advertising ecosystem. Well, before I get too far in my superiority about it being the very, very first time, I will notice there was a case back in 2016, almost 10 years ago now, against a location data analytics SDK provider called InMobi that had a kind of similar outcome, in that it was a case in which the FTC found that companies have to respect the location permission setting, another operating system setting. So not the first time they've implemented operating system respect mandates, so to speak, but the first time it's been applied specifically to personalized advertising and limit ad tracking. So with that explanation of what's going on, thoughts maybe from Kara first and then Aaron on how you feel the impact of this will be.
I will defer largely to Aaron on this, but I will say that from a contractual point of view, the notion of actually incorporating and figuring out how to enforce these sort of provisions is something that is mind-boggling to me. And maybe we can come back to the contractual restrictions later on in a broader sense. But over to you, Aaron.
Well, I agree with you about the contractual restrictions and enforcement. I think enforcement is one of the most challenging areas for a lot of tech policy issues, simply because the actual effects on the ground are often very easy to overlook or very hard to measure. From my perspective, I think this is a really interesting piece of the decision, simply because if you're an engineer and you are interested in doing some kind of advertising and you receive a signal that says, okay, this person is opted out and it's tied to this one identifier, it's easy to say, okay, well, I can't use that identifier, but what else can I use in order to try and get at least some targeting information for this user? Well, the structure of the decision and the way the FTC is going, they really are trying to make this more of a relationship between the advertiser and the user, and the platform is just facilitating the communication. So if that's actually the case, then you could look at the limit ad tracking option as the user saying, look, I don't want any ad tracking, whether it's tied to this particular hardware identifier or some other mechanism. And I think that's actually the broader lesson that I would convey to engineering teams, to say, look, you may not have access to the ID at all because it's zeroed out on the Apple ecosystem, or you may have access to the ID with this clear flag right next to it every time you're accessing it on the Android system. But in reality, it's not about that idea. It's about the tracking in general. And we want to make sure that whatever we're doing is compliant with the spirit here, because that's actually what the FTC is trying to emphasize.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, my takeaway is I'm seeing similarities to the global privacy control and the other trends in the advertising ecosystem largely. And I wonder, to what extent could you apply this to other sorts of platform settings? This is a really, really clear one. Let's end, and then we have a great question in the chat. Would welcome questions from anyone else who is listening and thinking about these cases. Let's end with a very old issue, but in my view, a reinforcement that the FTC has just placed on the ground here, which is around what consent requires. In both X mode and in media, there was a legal violation related to a material omission in consent gathering for location data, but I think there's broader implications here as well. Location data is just a uniquely sensitive type of information. In X mode, there was a finding that X mode's omission of the fact that location data would be later sold and shared for national security purposes, sort of broadly defined, would have been material to consumers in deciding whether or not to grant access to location data. And so it should have been included, not just in the privacy policy, but in the consent screen, which is somewhat of a big deal, I think, and possibly unique. In market, the very similar case that dropped last week, we had a similar but perhaps slightly more broad-reaching for this audience analysis around what has to go into the consent screen. And the FTC similarly found a violation for a material omission when in market mentioned in the context of getting consent that location data would be used for functionality purposes, shopping rewards, points, getting a promotion, I think, when you walk into a store, or getting information when you walk into a store, and creating shopping lists. These are the two things that its apps were largely used for. Mentioning those kinds of functionality requirements, but omitting the fact that the same data would also be used for targeted advertising and profiling purposes was considered a material omission. And interesting to me, sort of from a legal perspective, is that this material omission is not only deceptive under Section 5, under the FTC's Section 5 authority, but also unfair under the FTC's Unfairness authority. That is how far it went. So, there's a lot of talk about what has to go into consent to make it meaningful. The FTC's description of this was that half-truths will be considered misleading and are not appropriate in this context, mentioning functionality but omitting this much more relevant to a lot of individual users advertising use case. So more thoughts on that and what I've missed there around getting consent.
I think this is one of the big takeaways from these orders. There has, I'll say, globally been this opaqueness in the consent screens, and you've highlighted a couple of them. I think that if you read many of the consent screens, you will find buried within them some indirect reference to providing information to the government or national security, but just buried or so opaque. And I would say a message to companies out there is that it's time to describe in some detail the categories of the categories for which you are sharing the information. And I have a specific question, though, about sharing for national security. And that is, to the extent that now, let's say Xmode says we are going to share with companies that provide services for national security and so on, and you get affirmative express consent. Does that mean a user can also withdraw or revoke their consent in the national security context? And what are the implications of that? This is an open question for me.
Mm-hmm. In at least one of these, the remedy that the FTC has implemented is a requirement that the company have a method to be able to withdraw consent. How do you do that for downstream uses? I think is more of a practical challenge. Aaron, what do you think about that from a technical perspective?
Well, I actually think it's kind of related to a comment we had in the chat from Michael Lamb about consent and location also potentially affecting fraud. If you follow the FTC's reasoning here, I actually think the more expressive description of what you're consenting to would help the fraud case, because now they're not saying you can't use it when it's functionally relevant. Like fraud would be a good example. In my opinion, they don't mention fraud in the case, but I think it is a good functional reason why you would need the location data. If you include that in the consent screen, now consumers are feeling a little bit more assured that what's happening with their data is actually something that they want to happen with their data. If you include consent for advertising purposes along with that flag, that changes the consumer's reaction. One of the other things that I was thinking about kind of related to this is the in-person transactions, where if you're actually at a cashier's checkout station and they're asking, can I have your phone number, without explaining what the phone number is for, is that potentially deceptive or unfair in this exact same way? Because often it's used for identifying rewards points for whatever rewards program you have, but it can also be included for an advertising identifier. Mm-hmm. And that sort of transaction happens very quickly. It's in person. It may not be standard across the entire organization, but this is the example that first came to mind when I read the thing, because it is one of those scenarios that happens all the time. And we may end up seeing some fatigue as a result of seeing these expressive consent screens that describe all of the possible purposes the data could be put to.
I completely agree, and how we've described this issue over the years is an issue of consent bundling as sort of in industry term for how this works. Historically, the consent has been given through the operating system, through that permission screen that you see on your phone when you click yes to allow permission to location data. But increasingly, we see companies in this space adding an additional screen either before or after that either explains it, gives a little more information, or has a whole separate consent. So, you can consent to the app functionally, but not consent to further downstream purposes such as targeted advertising. We have another great question in the chat let's see. So the operating system, the question is, should the operating system level privacy settings be automatically set to be off for phones used exclusively by children? Quite possible. So the thing that, Lisa, thank you so much for pointing out that I don't know that we mentioned, is that when you set up a new phone, this feature is off by default. The user has to go in and affirmatively turn it on to enable the opt-out globally for apps. I haven't actually seen a lot of good data over the years for how many people actually do that, except for a study from Tune from at least 5 years ago that put the number around 20 to 25% of users of iPhones are turning on limit ad tracking. Do not know whether that is still relevant. I suspect it's a little higher today, given the increasing awareness of privacy and data protection. But it's still a default of being off, and the user has to go in and make an affirmative choice. Thoughts on whether that should be different for certain types of phones? I'll start. I think yes. I think that makes perfect sense. And I think that decisions like this from the FTC and the X mode decision, which give more power, I guess, behind the meaning of these kinds of settings, will help support policies like that. I don't know. Aaron and Karen, what do you think?
I agree with you. I think it does make sense to have this setting off by default for certain populations. Children are a really good one to look at. I think it may also make sense on the older end of the spectrum. The FTC has been very aggressive in looking at fraud and older populations. And this is another area where I think that might apply. The connection that came to mind when we were talking about defaults is actually what you were saying earlier with the GPC and some of the browser level opt-outs. I think that is another similar area where thinking about what is the default setting and what should it be makes a lot of sense. The two perspectives that are at play in that discussion are almost certainly going to be at play in this one as well, which is it default setting for the application, like from the perspective of the application developer? Do you have to have a configurable setting somewhere in the settings page of your app that is off by default? Or is it from the perspective of the user? Is the user the one who opens the device, gets it out of the box, and then whatever their experience is, that is the default experience? And when they make changes, that is the non-default experience, meaning they could download other applications, which would not necessarily have to be off by default. For something like a phone, it makes absolute sense to think about what should the default setting be, but I don't think this is an easy discussion. I think there will be lots of edge cases and scenarios where it makes sense to go one way or the other.
Yeah, excellent. I totally agree. And we had another person in the chat raising, I won't dig into this too far, but just raising the fact that there are implications here for cookie banner pop-ups as well. 100%. We're at the half an hour, so I'm going to wrap up with a final question for Kara that we were debating yesterday, which is, when you see these complaints and proposed orders in X mode and in market, do we see the FTC carving out the scope of what could be done through future rulemaking, which we're expecting as early as this year, around what Section 5 unfairness means? Because again, I don't want to underplay the importance of this. We didn't see very many unfairness cases in the privacy context at all, not many, until this year and last year. And all of a sudden, we're kind of seeing a flood of them, really significant cases. And these are both cases that, although they have some deception elements, rest primarily on the concept of unfairness. So is the FTC carving out the scope of what it intends to do or hopes to do through rulemaking? Or is this perhaps a more typically conservative, in a sense, approach from the FTC that we might see them expand upon and go even further this year or next year in future years? That's the question I'm going to give Kara, the last word.
Well, I don't want to read the tea leaves, but I do think that it is the former. I think the FTC is setting out the boundaries and the expectations, the baseline, and that to go beyond, for example, what they're doing now with these two cases, I think that both politically and economically, it wouldn't fly. So to start targeting particular use cases and creating case law to set the boundaries, that's what I think they're doing. And Stacey, I know that you have a somewhat contrary point of view.
I, as a general rule, trust your instincts on these things, Kara. I think that's probably right. I wonder if they may go farther, though, and I'll just put this out because the concept of redacting sensitive locations is such a kind of blunt instrument, as we've talked about, and because there's so much possibility for inferring, revealing, or unexpected information from location information over time, even when it doesn't come from sensitive locations, I would expect the FTC to address the latter issue perhaps a little bit more aggressively in future rulemaking when they have the opportunity to look not just at one company, but at the broader landscape and say, this is perhaps gone too far, this commercial marketplace that we've enabled for the sharing and sale and use of precise, persistent location data from users.
Well, I have a question then. Does that mean that we are going to stop the train that's already left the station with regards to autonomous driving, connected vehicles, the integration of all these sensors from the cars? Are we going to get rid of usage-based insurance? So I don't see that going beyond these kinds of efforts are realistic, because there are so many other ways that location data is used, and it's not just coming from our phones anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you may be right, and you know what? I'll go on an intellectual limb here and say I wonder if these things might end up the same in practice anyway, because if you take a very robust view of what meaningful consent looks like, and you see these consent decrees or these proposed orders adopting the language of consent from the GDPR, meaningful, informed, specific, unambiguous, maybe people don't consent and certain use cases go away and certain use cases get enabled anyway. So yeah, it's really interesting. Aaron, any thoughts before we wrap?
I think that's an interesting discussion. It seems like the kind of thing that the FTC would probably not be in a position to be more explicit about without some sort of rulemaking. So you're kind of left reading the tea leaves because they're not going to make a clear statement.
Excellent. We will continue reading the tea leaves at Future Privacy Forum and amongst our amazing community, which includes friends like Kara. Thank you so much to Kara and to Aaron for joining this morning. And thank you to everybody who joined and listened in this morning. We've got resources in the chat. If you want to learn more, feel free to reach out, and we will see you next time.